Hello and welcome to this RCTV special report. We will have a conversation with Dr. Stephen Beresford, a globally recognized expert on polymetallic nickel copper PGE deposits. Mr. Beresford previously worked at major mining companies leading exploration efforts for world-class deposits, including serving as Chief Geologist for First Quantum and MMG and Chief Geoscientist at IGO. He recently joined Power Nickel as a director, where he helps lead their efforts in exploring their Nisk project in Quebec, which hosts a nickel resource and an exciting new more copper PGE polymetallic zone named the Lion Zone. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you.
Let's start with an overview of what type of deposit we're talking about here. What is a polymetallic nickel copper deposit?
So it's actually a subtype of a nickel copper system, and that might surprise a few people, but it's an important non-academic nuance that there's a range of deposit styles included under the banner nickel sulphides, and they include things that range from nickel dominant, and obviously in the current market are less of interest, all the way through to systems that are PG and copper dominant and low grade. And a good example of that would be the Platte Reef, which is an amazing deposit. But there are a special subtype that are nickel, copper, and PGs and high grade. So they have tonnage and grade. They're relatively rare, and we call them the polymetallic systems. And the big one is Oktyabrsky in Russia, Sakatti in Finland. And the reason why this isn't an academic nuance is this, and even in today's market, this is the premier deposit style. So if investors are out there thinking, it's got nickel in the title, nickel sounds like we don't want any more nickel, or we're concerned about supply. This is about some of the answers to the world's copper problems, and it's straight economics. This is the world's most profitable ore style, but it's got a catch. And the reason why people are probably not familiar with it is it's a relatively rare occurrence. So the Lion discovery it's just not something that happens every year or even every decade. So we're a little bit unfamiliar, and Canada's been very, very busy with low-grade nickel sulphide deposits in the last decade, and that's not the deposit style that suits the ongoing story.
Now, what controls the thickness of these high-grade sulfide deposits?
So there's a few ingredients. So one of the key things that's really important about polymetallics in general is that they're not just including nickel plus copper or PGs, they're zoned. And so what do I mean by that? It means they have zones that are dominated by nickel, and they have zones that are dominated by copper. And the reason why that's important is the copper-rich portions are further upgraded and further enriched in other metals. And we'll get to that in a minute with the enrichment in copper, silver, gold, platinum, and palladium, and a little bit of nickel. And yet the other side of it is just nickel and cobalt dominant. That's the side that we're more familiar with. But these further enriched systems, they're just way more higher economics, essentially, higher grade in every sort of sense. So in terms of controlling thicknesses, there's many nuances, and lots of geologists will tell you nuances forever. But let's just cut right to the economics chase. That is, the system is formed originally inside an intrusion, which is think of it as like a receptacle in the crust. You can't really get ore easily outside of that receptacle, so it's confined. And it forms nickel sulfides, and then the nickel separates, the copper separates from that. And as a result, we can get copper separated from the nickel over great distances. And what we're seeing at Lion is very, very common around the world in all nickel sulfide deposits, but it happens at small scale, where we get nickel remobilized away from the copper, from the nickel, copper remobilized away from the nickel. This can happen over kilometers in scale, and it's familiar in a number of deposit scale styles. And a good example would be Salibi Piquet in Botswana, which is currently being explored by a Canadian company, Premier Nickel, who are doing a good job. Lime's a lot higher grade than Celebi piqui, but it's a very good analogy for what's controlling thickness. So that's a long-winded answer of saying thickness is now controlled by what we call remobilization. So what does that mean? It means that this portion of Quebec is 2.7 billion years old, and there's a lot of things that have happened to the land and the geography and the geology since 2.7, and the ore is now redistributed over a large zone and thinner than it was. And that's what we're looking at Nova, at Lime. We're looking at huge movement of copper away from nickel over large areas. And so thickness now is governed by what we call structural geology. So essentially the deformation processes that have taken place since 2.7 billion years old. This is something that the Canadians understand very well, pioneers in their VMS systems, and very well understood in Thompson, for example. So very familiar to Canadians, but as I mentioned, the real key is it's not something that happens every decade. And so the last big discovery like this was probably 30 years ago. That's longer than most of us have been working in this industry. What can we expect going forward is the thickness is, let's call it 10 to 15 meters at Lion. And occasionally right now we're in zones that are 30 to 40 meters in thickness. That's the sort of thicknesses we should expect in these sort of processes. Can you get thicker than this? Very much so. That's what we call fold thickening. That's something we're trying to do. You'll see that in the way we're working. But here's the catch, you can also get thinner as well. So the thing can thicken and thin, and that's just part of the learning process that we go through as we'll be discovering.
Great. Now, what techniques are used to discover these deposits?
So most nickel sulfides, the workhorse of nickel sulfide industry is what we call electromagnetics. So we're very fortunate that nickel sulfides contain minerals like pyrrhotite, which are great conductors. And as a result, we can directly detect ore. So that's completely the opposite of something like gold systems, which are very familiar to Canadians and to those in Quebec and Ontario, and dominate their industry. But we can actually directly image and detect the ore. So EM, which is the acronym for electromagnetics, is the workhorse. There's a few caveats, and these caveats are important. One is we're chasing largely copper sulfides, which are lower conductivity. So it's a little bit more challenging. And we've got a really, really unusual problem up at James Bay, is that we're right in the heart of Hydro-Quebec. And we're one of the great selling points about our project is that we have the power station and transmission towers everywhere. So we're in the middle of where you'd want to be if you'd want to build an ore body. But those transmission towers, of course, affect our ability to work with electromagnetics. So we've had to be very clever and go back and learn from others in the past of how to do EM in an environment which is just oversupplied by power. So the name power nickel, is alluding to the fact that we've got so much power right next to us, but it comes with more challenges for those of us who are involved in the discovery process, and that we've got to go out and find a way to be smarter about how to do it. It's a key technology. You'll see a lot of it going forward in our releases. It enables us to see deeper, but it also enables us to, if you'll see in our releases, one of the things that you need to do is step off and really understand the scale of Lime. We really don't know how big the system's going to be. We know the facts of what we've found so far. And the confidence to step out on bigger and bigger areas comes from downhole EM. So that's a technique where we have a loop at the surface of wire and a probe that goes down the hole, and it enables us to see off the hole on the order of 150 meters. And the way to think of it is, if you're sort of visualizing that, is imagine a single hole, which is NQ core is about 6 centimeters wide. Imagine it's surrounded by a large toilet roll. that's actually how wide you're really drilling. You're not actually drilling the core, but you are imaging off hole a radius around the hole that enables you to know whether you've got massive sulphides. So it's a very effective technique of finding more ore, but also conveying to investors that we can step out on the ore body with a lot of confidence and find and continue to deliver massive sulfide results. So key technique going forward, and something you'll see in more releases and more talk from Power Nickel.
Now, looking at Lion, obviously it's more copper and rich in the I guess noble metals or precious metals, versus the Nisk main deposit that's more nickel rich. Does this mean, with the zoning, that like at Sakatti, there may be some undiscovered nickel sulfides as well near Lion?
So the short answer is yes, and the more nuanced answer follows. So this is a nickel sulfide system. This is a copper nickel deposit, and there will be nickel in this story. We already have, and so we know. So there's a couple of scenarios to consider. One is that Nisk is the nickel end member and Lion is the copper end member of the system. They're 5.5 kilometers apart. That's a very optimistic view, but it's also a very realistic view. It is entirely consistent with what we've got today. Let's see what happens. If you look at how we're exploring, we are exploring between the two. That is the logical, that's what the data tells us to do. It's also what the most optimistic view tells us to do. So either way, we're going to answer this question. The other scenario is there are two isolated systems that are both zoned in nickel and copper. And the upside of that story is we could go deeper underneath Nisk to find more Lion-like systems, or we could go along strike from Lion and find more nickel systems. At the moment, we are just trying to stay in the copper polymetallic story for very good reasons. Not only would the market prefer we stay in copper, but we're just hitting grades that people haven't seen for 30 years with these very high copper grades. I mean, if Nisk or if Lion becomes an ore body, it'd be one of the highest grade ore bodies in the world, copper ore bodies. Just copper by itself. Let's not add in any other fruit. And if you had a look, and if anybody's interested, go out there and tabulate just palladium or platinum intersections over the last 20 years and just see where power sits, and some of these intersections from Lion really intersect. This is a very high grade PGE and high grade copper system. And the other metals that everybody really notices, one of our major investors is Robert Friedland, and he said, what's the story with the gold and silver? It's like, no, it's exactly part of the story. These highly enriched portions of copper PGs are enriched in gold and silver. In fact, one of the things that I tell Terry, our CEO, is the first thing that I do in looking for this deposit style worldwide is look for silver. It's the silver and a few other metals, semi-metals, that tell me that I am on to one of these big systems. That's what I do. And that's what tells me it's different to some of these other nickel only systems in the world. That's how we realize extra geological nuances taking place that is going to lead to what I think is a superior economic system. So to answer your question about Sakatti zones upwards from nickel to copper. So does Oktyabrsky. Sudbury, which is a slightly different system, zones downwards. What does that mean? It zones down from nickel dominant to copper dominant. This is the best example that Canadians probably have, is Sudbury. If you wanted to understand what the zoning looks like, look at some of the footwall deposits at Sudbury. Please don't confuse that message that this is Sudbury-like. Sudbury is a unique beast in its own right. One of the common questions I always get here therefore is, what's a good analogy? And everybody really wants one, but that's why I mix my answer up. As a technical guy, I'm like, if I was out there in the technical world trying to understand this, it's like Sakatti and Oktyabrsky in terms of processes, It's like Sleepy Pickwe in terms of some of the controls on thickness. None of these systems are, Sudbury's present in Canada, but if you wanted a Canadian only perspective, we really don't have a single analog for you. This is a deposit style that we haven't seen in Canada for a while.
Now, we've spoken a bit about zoning and the different deposits here, but why is Lion so rich in copper and the noble metals?
So the short answer is, I would say it's expected for it to be. So I know that sounds counterintuitive, because that's why I spent a bit of time at the beginning explaining why polymetallic. You could say, so companies like Vale, old Inco, would call this copper-rich nickel deposits. Companies like Anglo American will call this polymetallic. And the reason why I call them polymetallic also is to draw attention to them as being economically superior, and so that people don't get caught up in thinking that just by exploring for nickel deposits that they'll find something like this. This is a different beast. It's not just a different beast in terms of economics, it just requires different processes. And so I'm very, very motivated by the concept of trying to explain why the economics is controlled by geology. So that zonation is really important. And the short answer for the non-geologists is, think of it like this: you form a nickel copper system and it has a grade of X, but then we've got a later process that upgrades just the copper portion, and it turns the copper system from being a credit metal, or the PGs from a credit metal, and concentrates them to make them not just economically superior and not just ore grade, but it turns them into these really, really high noble metal systems. So again, analogy would be, have a look at the footwall systems at Sudbury. The reason why they are noble metal rich is the same process. The reason why the top of Octobriski is so special, why that's such a super giant, is because these processes are going on. So geological processes are concentrating copper, gold, silver, platinum, palladium, and then a whole bunch of semi-metals and other metals with them that are not economic or barely economic in these systems. And so what you end up is, what feels like half the periodic table coming along for the ride, or what Terry calls the jewelry box. But in fact, it makes a lot of sense. In fact, Canadians have really dominated the research and understanding these systems over 30, 40 years. Sudbury knows how to process these systems. It's been doing this for a long period of time. It really is that people have forgotten about this deposit style, rather than it's really unique. It really is exactly what we would expect it to be at the moment. It's a polymetallic copper dominant with all these lovely noble metals added along the way, and that's exactly what we would expect.
And now shifting, finally here, shifting to a little bit more the personal side, looking at your personal motivation as an explorer. You've spoken at times about the link between your search for these deposits and that of historical figures. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, look, so I've worked in this deposit style my whole career. I've been very fortunate, and a few years down, I did what some would call counterintuitive advice and decided to double down. And this isn't a moment where I'm trying to tell the world it's really what they should do, but I am telling myself what I'm doing. This is the only thing I do globally. I have a number of companies around the world, and I sit on a few boards, and I only explore for this deposit style. So that's very, very specialized. I'm not just a nickel guy now. I really am the guy who focuses only on things like Lion. And that's how Terry found me and got me involved in things. And this is what I do. And one of the places that I'm really obsessed with is Central Asia. I think that's an incredible place to go looking for these systems. I've been on record as saying that. I work with a company called Altai Resources in Kazakhstan. And the historical sentiment is really just an interesting motivator on the side. So part of the motivation is that we can track through history the development and finding of this polymetallic system in ancient history. So before nickel was even known as a metal, we've known that the Hittite Empire in what's now modern day Turkey and the pharaonic tombs in Egypt, they've been finding nickel sulphide systems. And that's a nice little story that goes with it. But the one that really motivates me is post Alexander the Great's conquest of the Persian Empire. Nickel sulphides, nickel copper PG, so polymetallic system, same exact deposit style that we're talking about here, was used in minting coins in what's called Greco-Bactria. And these coins, we know where the coins are, but we don't know where the ore body comes from. And so, you know, for one of a lovely sort of glam-like title, one of my motivators is to find Alexander the Great's or post-Alexander Great's Greek Hellenistic empires, to find this missing giant deposit. It's still sitting there. And one of the things I've learned is, you know, deposits like Norilsk were found a long time ago and were refound hundreds of years later. And I still think, so one of the keys to this deposit style, unlike porphyries and sediment-hosted copper and iron oxide copper gold, which dominate the world's copper deposit styles, those deposits have very big footprints. What that means is they're easier to find. And this system that I'm talking about has a very small footprint, a lot higher grade. Now we're moving into a world where a lot of our big scale copper mines are taking up to 20, 23, 24 years to put into production. So one of the answers to the ongoing energy transition is we've got to get more out of the deposits we've got. We all know that, but we also need to find new copper supply. And I really strongly believe that we're missing a copper deposit style that is rarer, but actually considerably more economic, and therefore could be put into production a lot faster. Your average high-grade nickel copper system is put in production within 3 to 4 years. Your average low-grade porphyry is in the 20 plus. So fundamental difference because of economics. Again, the two are intimately related: large, low grade versus small, high grade. And I think the Alexander the Great reminder is that we've been doing this throughout history. We've been mining nickel copper systems. They thought they were copper. The pharaonic Egyptians thought they were copper. And I think we're all still making the same mistake. We're still all forgetting about this deposit style that can solve a lot of our economic issues.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Beresford, and we will look forward to the further exploration results from the exciting polymetallic discovery at Nisk.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.